Hi, this is Roman, and today we're going to be going over Unit 8 on conditional probability, Day 5 on sample spaces, Part 1, with a focus question of how can we create different representations of sample space and use them to calculate probability. So I'm going to be showing a few different varieties of activities here that could be incorporated in the lesson. Most specifically here, we are going to be addressing sample space in the intro and launch with respect to possible outcomes and how many outcomes are in certain sample spaces. We'll be using slide 10 in reference to the graphics that are associated with experiments. And we'll be using slide 11 for an idea of how to identify a sample space without creating graphics, tree diagrams, or these tedious tasks of representing every possible outcome and listing them out, which is very time consuming. So here is my activity builder in Desmos. The first activity I have is a card sort. So the focus of this activity would be for students to see the difference between an experiment of rolling one die versus two, right? And then comparing those sample spaces and seeing the difference visually, right? And also seeing another common theme here of a standard deck of cards or drawing from a standard deck of cards and seeing the sample space for that visually. So this allows students to build a concrete understanding that we're hoping to get them into an abstract understanding of this content and building those foundations here. So this is one sample of a card sort, right? And we're really getting to these experiments that can get a little bit more complicated, like rolling two die and increasing that sample space. So that's one activity. The next activity is a word problem that I created. Mike and Lisa disagree about the sample space for the following situation. Two cards are drawn from a deck of cards. After the first card is drawn, it is not placed back into the deck. Mike believes the sample space is 52 for both cards that are drawn. Lisa believes the sample space is 52 for the first card drawn and then 51 for the second card drawn. Who is correct? So here we have a sketch activity where students can possibly look at the outcomes and think about what happens if we're taking a card and not placing it back with respect to the sample space for that second event that's occurring there, right? And I feel like this is a great question that could provoke discourse in the class. I notice here that I only had the sketch. I would also want to include a text input. So now students could write what they have and that can be used. And I'm showing students their classmates' responses so they can respond to one another during these types of lessons where we're not in a classroom. So that's the second activity I wanted to share. The third and fourth activity are creations of sample spaces. So I have creating a tree diagram and a table for flipping a coin 2 times, right? So for the tree diagram here, you get to utilize Desmos and you might see something like a student writing heads and tails and then possibly utilizing the line feature here. And again, showing that sample space as so, right? And this is a great way to visually see what's happening. And then here in the table, we can get an idea of how we would write it, given that the two options are heads or tails. So here I have heads, comma heads in my first box. This matrix might be a little bit early to introduce matrices as a vocabulary word. Just call it a table for now. And then here in my top right, I could represent this as tails, heads, right, which would make my bottom left heads, tails, and my last box here would be tails, tails. And this is great if they ever get that visual. If they've created that visual, they're going to have much more comfort than just seeing it for the first time. As an extension to this, right, we can ask students to create a tree diagram for flipping a coin 3 times, and then really ask them what's happening here between flipping 2 times and 3 times to that sample space. How is it being affected by that extra flip of a coin? And then based on that, I would actually give them the graphics. So we spoke about listing out the sample spaces, seeing these tree diagrams. One thing that wasn't mentioned is, what if they see the sample spaces as a set, right? So we want to ask them for this connection here also, right? How do the sets connect to the graphics? Because sometimes we're going to be given sets for a sample space for something that's not so organic for us to think about, like flipping coins, or an experiment that we can picture. And it's a good idea to get these notations ahead and ask students what the connections are for them, and really what do they notice about the difference in the sample spaces, as that was our focus question here for flipping 2 coins versus 3 coins, with respect to this sample set notation, and even with respect to the graphics. Now, my last activity, and this would really sum everything up, is how can we find the sample space of the experiment below without creating any graphics, right? So something I want to do here is I'm going to add the calculator for the whole lesson. And we want students to be able in this activity to say something like, well, there are 2 options for that first spin. There are 3 options for the second spin. And then there are 4 options for the last spin. And if we multiply them, we get 24, right? And that's a way to do it without making these huge tree diagrams, without doing these tedious tasks, to have our correct possible outcomes for our probabilities as we do these questions, right? And you can ask them to quickly check, right? If you look at these tree diagrams or these tables, if I count the end of them, I see 4, 8, 12, and I have 2 sets of them, which make 24. I could also count each one of these here, and I'll also get 24. So they should see that connection. So I will be sharing this link, and these are some activities that you guys can use for Unit 8 on conditional probability, Day 5.